The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the rows of canned goods, casting a pale glow on the dull routine of Evelyn's Wednesday evening. She reached for a can of soup, her favorite, a habit she'd cultivated over years of living alone. The days were quiet, predictable, and most of all, safe. At 52, Evelyn found comfort in her solitude, though she'd often wondered if she hadn't also grown invisible, a shadow slipping unnoticed through the world. That's when she saw him. He was standing by the produce section, casually inspecting a cluster of grapes. His presence was like a ripple in still water. Something about him stirred the quiet air. He couldn't have been more than 30, with tousled dark hair and an easy smile that he shared freely with the elderly woman offering him unsolicited tips on picking fruit. His laugh, genuine and unguarded, traveled through the store like a melody, and Evelyn felt her heart skip, a flutter she hadn't felt in years. Embarrassed by her reaction, she looked away quickly, focusing on the shelf before her. "Pull yourself together," she thought, shaking her head. But as she wandered the aisles, she found herself glancing in his direction, her curiosity getting the better of her. She didn't expect him to notice her. She was dressed in her usual grocery shopping attire, faded jeans and a cardigan that had seen better days. Yet as she rounded the corner, there he was, standing in front of the baking aisle, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she hesitated. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "Would you happen to know if this is the kind of sugar you use for cookies?" Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. He held up a bag of brown sugar, his expression earnest. She opened her mouth, her mind racing for a reply, and instead of brushing him off, she smiled. "That depends. What kind of cookies are you making?" His grin widened, lighting up his face in a way that made him look even younger. "Chocolate chip. Or at least I'm trying to. First attempt." "Well then," Evelyn said, surprising herself with her own playful tone, "you've got the right sugar. Just make sure you don't skimp on the chocolate chips." He laughed, and the sound sent a small, unexpected warmth through her chest. "Noted. Thanks for the tip." As he turned back to the shelf, Evelyn felt something shift within her, a small, almost imperceptible crack in the walls she'd built around herself. For the first time in what felt like forever, her quiet life didn't feel so comfortable. It felt lonely, and she couldn't help but wonder who this man was, and why his presence had stirred something she thought she'd buried long ago. The next time Evelyn went to the store, she told herself it was purely coincidence. She'd forgotten eggs, nothing more. But as she pushed her cart through the aisles, a quiet hope stirred beneath her practical intentions. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like him didn't frequent grocery stores at the same time each week. And yet, as she turned into the coffee aisle, there he was, studying the labels with the same thoughtful expression he'd worn while choosing grapes. "Evelyn, right?" he said, his face lighting up as though greeting an old friend. Her breath caught at the sound of her name. She had no idea how he'd remembered it. She'd mentioned it briefly when he introduced himself as Ryan during their chat about cookies. "That's me," she said, trying to sound casual. "You're back for more baking supplies?" He held up a tin of cocoa powder, grinning sheepishly. "Brownies this time. Figured I'd keep the disaster theme going." Evelyn chuckled, surprising herself with the ease of her laughter. "I'm sure they'll be fine. You survived the cookies, didn't you?" "Barely. My sister called them charcoal chips." "Sounds like you might need a coach," she teased, her tone lighter than it had been in years. "Are you volunteering?" he asked, his voice warm and sincere. Evelyn's cheeks flushed. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I haven't baked in years, but I'm happy to pass on some wisdom from my glory days." From that moment, their encounters began to feel less like chance and more like inevitability. Their conversations grew longer, touching on everything from recipes to books to the quirks of a small town they both called home. Ryan was witty, thoughtful, and refreshingly genuine, qualities that drew Evelyn in despite the quiet voice in her head warning her to be cautious. One evening, she found herself lingering in the parking lot after running into him again. They stood beside her car, talking as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. "Thanks for humoring my baking escapades," he said, leaning casually against the hood of his car. "You make this whole cooking thing less intimidating." Evelyn smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunset. "And you make grocery shopping a lot more entertaining." For the first time in years, her days didn't feel quite so predictable. Ryan had become a bright thread weaving its way through the fabric of her routine, and she couldn't help but look forward to seeing him again. What she didn't expect was how much she'd started to miss him when he wasn't around. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning, as Evelyn stood in her kitchen, staring blankly at the teapot as it whistled. The realization hit her like a sudden gust of wind, knocking the breath from her chest. She was thinking about Ryan again. It wasn't the first time, but something about this moment felt different. Her mind replayed their last conversation. A simple chat about his dog, a rambunctious Labrador named Max. She remembered the way his face lit up as he spoke, how his laughter came so easily, as though life itself were an endless source of joy. That feeling had lingered with her, an unspoken warmth that followed her home and kept her company in the quiet of her evenings. But now, standing in her kitchen, Evelyn felt a pang of something sharper, deeper. It wasn't just fondness or gratitude for the way he'd brightened her days. It was longing. She sank into a chair, clutching the edge of the table as her thoughts spiraled. This is ridiculous, she told herself. He's young enough to be my son. And yet, there it was, undeniable and unrelenting. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. Her heart, long dormant and cautious, was stirring to life, and it terrified her. She thought of all the reasons this was impossible. Society wouldn't approve. Her friends would be scandalized. Her family might think she'd lost her mind. But more than that, Evelyn worried about what Ryan might think. To him, she was probably just a friendly woman who gave decent baking advice. Surely, he couldn't see her as anything more. Could he? The question clung to her, even as she tried to dismiss it. She thought back to the way his gaze lingered when they spoke, the warmth in his voice when he said her name. Was she imagining it, or had there been something more in those moments? Her hands trembled as she poured her tea, the mundane action grounding her for a moment. She had no answers, only the growing awareness of her feelings and the fear they carried. Evelyn had spent years building a life of quiet contentment, free from the messiness of romantic entanglements. She wasn't sure she had the courage to invite that kind of chaos back into her world. But as the days stretched on and Ryan lingered in her thoughts, she knew one thing for certain. Something within her had shifted, and there was no going back. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about him. Each time she passed the grocery store, she'd hesitate for a moment, half hoping to see him there, even though she knew it wasn't realistic. She told herself it was just an innocent connection, a fleeting spark in the routine of her life. But the truth was, every time they spoke, a part of her deepened, felt something she hadn't felt in years. That Saturday afternoon, she sat on her couch, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as she tried to sort through the mess of thoughts swirling in her head. She could almost hear Ryan's voice, clear as day, asking about her plans for the weekend. His eyes had held that familiar warmth, that curiosity that seemed to draw her in. She was starting to look forward to the moments when their paths crossed, and that terrified her. Evelyn had always been careful with her heart, with her life. She had built a shell around herself over the years, and it had served her well. But now, with Ryan's presence like an unexpected spark in the darkness, she felt the fragile walls she'd constructed begin to crack. What was this? She wondered. Was it just loneliness? A passing attraction? The questions piled up, but the uncertainty didn't stop her heart from racing whenever she saw him. She thought about the way his fingers had brushed against hers once when they both reached for the same carton of eggs. A fleeting touch, a brief moment, but it stayed with her for days. There was something intimate in the way he looked at her, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. But then the fear crept in. Fear of the inevitable judgment from others. At her age, was it acceptable to feel this way about someone so much younger? She imagined the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the judgmental stares. People didn't expect women her age to be desirable. Society had certain rules, and she was well aware of them. A woman over 50 who looked for romance with a younger man was, well, it just wasn't done. And what if she was wrong? What if she read him completely wrong, misinterpreting every glance and every word? What if he was just being polite, nothing more? The thought of feeling humiliated, of putting herself out there only to be rejected, was enough to keep her up at night. But as she sat there, staring at the empty space across from her, she realized something. The fear of judgment, of failure, didn't matter as much as the fear of regret. What if she let this feeling pass, buried it, convinced herself it was nothing? What if she missed out on something she could never get back? I've spent so many years playing it safe, she thought, but maybe that's not the way I want to live anymore. Her heart was uncertain. Her thoughts conflicted. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. She was at a crossroads, and the path she chose from here on would be one of risk, of vulnerability. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Evelyn stared at the phone in her hand, the screen blinking back at her with a text from Ryan. I finally made those brownies. They're not half bad. You want to come by and taste test? Her heart skipped. There it was, the invitation she'd been both dreading and hoping for. For days, she'd been trying to come up with a reason to reach out, to invite him into her space. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't need a grand excuse. It didn't have to be about the brownies or some pretext about a recipe. It could simply be because she wanted to see him. The thought sent a rush of warmth through her chest, but it was immediately followed by a wave of apprehension. What am I doing? She asked herself. She set the phone down, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. For years, she had cultivated a life of routine, of predictable interactions. The idea of stepping outside that comfort zone, of opening herself up to something new, something so uncharted, was terrifying. What if she made a fool of herself? What if this whole thing was a mistake? But as she sat there, her mind raced through the moments they'd shared. The laughter over cookies, the way he made her feel seen, the quiet but meaningful connections they had built in such a short time. He wasn't just someone she admired from a distance anymore. He had become someone important, someone whose presence in her life she cherished. She could feel the weight of the decision. To open the door to him, to invite him into the safe, solitary life she had so carefully constructed, it was a risk. But maybe it was the kind of risk worth taking. She picked up the phone again, her fingers trembling slightly. She hesitated, then typed, I'd love to. What time? As she hit send, she realized her heart was racing faster than she cared to admit. She wasn't sure what this evening would bring, what it might change, but in that moment, Evelyn knew she had made the decision to take a step forward. No more hiding behind the walls of caution. No more letting fear dictate her choices. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it. And as she began to prepare for his visit, setting out glasses, putting on a touch of perfume she hadn't worn in ages, she couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, she was doing something for herself. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock, and Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had gone over every detail a dozen times. The warm glow of the lamp by the window, the soft music playing in the background, the simple but elegant spread she'd put together. She had even tried to calm her nerves with a glass of wine, but the flutter in her chest remained. She opened the door, and there he stood, Ryan, holding a tin of brownies in one hand, a nervous smile on his face. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he had just gotten out of the car and hadn't bothered to smooth it back. His eyes brightened when they met hers, and for a moment, Evelyn forgot everything. The carefully arranged setting, the wine, the nerves. Hi, he said, his voice warm and easy, just as it always was. I brought my failed baking experiment. Evelyn laughed, stepping aside to let him in. I'm sure they're far better than you're letting on. You've already proven yourself a champion in the kitchen. She gestured for him to sit on the couch as she took the tin from his hands. As she settled into the chair across from him, Evelyn couldn't ignore the electricity that filled the room. The space between them felt smaller now, more intimate. The light from the lamp cast soft shadows across his face, and Evelyn noticed the way his gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer than she expected. It was subtle, but there. They talked as they always had, about books, about movies, about life in the town they both inhabited. But now, every word felt weighted. There was an unspoken thread between them, pulling them closer, and Evelyn couldn't deny it any longer. She had invited him into her home, into her life, and in doing so, she had invited something deeper, something she hadn't fully allowed herself to acknowledge until this very moment. When Ryan offered her the first brownie, his fingers brushed hers, and the touch was electric. It wasn't the brief, accidental brush they had shared in the grocery store. This time, it lingered just long enough for her to feel the warmth of his hand. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked up to find him watching her, his expression a mix of uncertainty and anticipation. I really didn't expect this, he said quietly, his voice holding a trace of something more than casual conversation. I didn't know what to expect. Evelyn smiled, her heart pounding in her chest. Neither did I, she replied softly. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the words hanging between them. The air seemed to hum with possibilities, and Evelyn felt the world outside her home, outside this room, slip away. There was no judgment here, no expectations. Just this moment, this connection. Her thoughts swirled, and yet in the quiet of the room, Evelyn knew one thing. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear of what this might mean, of how others might react, was no longer consuming her. What mattered now was that they were together in this space, and whatever came next, she was ready to embrace it. Ryan reached for his glass of wine, his fingers grazing hers once more, and this time, there was no pretending it was just coincidence. The spark was there, undeniable. They were no longer just two people sharing conversation. They were two people on the precipice of something neither of them could fully grasp yet, but both of them wanted. As they leaned closer, their conversation slipping into comfortable silences, Evelyn couldn't help but smile. In this small, intimate space, with the light dancing across the walls, she felt more alive than she had in years. And for the first time in a long while, she knew she wasn't alone. The days following Ryan's visit passed in a blur. Evelyn found herself replaying the moments they shared over and over in her mind. The warmth of his presence, the quiet intimacy that had enveloped her home. It felt as though a door had opened, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the world outside her carefully curated life with new eyes. She'd spent so many years avoiding vulnerability, keeping herself hidden behind layers of caution and practicality. Love, she had told herself, was something for younger women, something for those who had time and energy to spare on messy emotions. As a woman in her 50s, she'd reconciled herself to the idea that her days of romance had passed. But now, with Ryan's memories so fresh in her thoughts, Evelyn found herself questioning everything she had believed about love and about herself. She had felt the stirring of something deep and real, and it wasn't just the heady rush of infatuation. It was more than that. It was a recognition of the profound connection they shared, a recognition that defied age, defied expectations. One evening, as she sat in the same chair where they had shared their quiet moments, Evelyn thought about the world's assumptions. How, for women like her, love was a thing of the past. It was something whispered about in secret, as if it was inappropriate for someone her age to seek out passion or companionship. But what if those assumptions were wrong? She thought of the way Ryan had looked at her, the way his gaze never wavered when they talked, how he seemed to see her, truly see her, in a way no one had for years. There was no judgment in his eyes, no discomfort with the age gap between them. There was only a shared warmth, a spark that defied logic. Love doesn't have an expiration date, she realized. It doesn't stop because of age. It doesn't stop because of rules. Love is just love. She had spent too many years adhering to societal expectations, too many years convinced that her worth diminished with time. But now, sitting alone in the soft evening light, Evelyn felt a quiet shift in herself. She was more than her age. She was more than the sum of her past relationships, more than the woman who had closed herself off for the sake of safety. She was someone capable of love, of passion, of desire, no matter how many years had passed since she first felt it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with the idea of loving again. Not just loving Ryan, but loving herself. Embracing the idea that love was a part of every stage of life. Even now, even here, Evelyn wasn't ashamed of how she felt. She didn't need to justify it to anyone. Love was hers to embrace, no matter how unconventional it might seem. And as she reached for her phone, ready to send Ryan a simple text to let him know she was thinking of him, she felt a surge of excitement in her chest. There was no telling where this connection might lead, but what mattered was that she was open to it, and that was enough. As Evelyn pressed send on the message, her heart felt light, unburdened by the weight of societal expectations that had once loomed over her. Thinking of you, it read simply, and as soon as it was out there, she felt an overwhelming sense of freedom, freedom to love without fear, to live without apology. The phone buzzed almost immediately. Me too, Ryan's reply came. I've been thinking about that night a lot. I can't wait to see you again. A smile tugged at Evelyn's lips. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she typed, "Same here." Let's see where this goes. There was something about those words, so simple and yet profound, that felt like a declaration of independence. She was no longer bound by the past, no longer constrained by the notion that love was only for the young. She was creating her own narrative, one filled with possibility. As she set the phone down, Evelyn looked out the window, watching as the evening sky turned from blue to indigo. The world seemed vast, yet full of promise. She no longer saw it through the lens of limitation, but through the lens of someone who had learned to embrace the unknown. Love, she realized, had no rules, no timeline. It arrived when it was ready, when you were ready. It didn't matter if you were in your 20s or your 50s. Love was not a commodity that expired with age. It was something eternal, something to be cherished, and most importantly, something that could be found at any point in life. And as she settled into her favorite chair, feeling the soft warmth of her home and the certainty of her own heart, Evelyn felt a deep peace. She had opened herself up to something unexpected, something beautiful, and in doing so, had learned that the best kind of love was the one that took you by surprise, the one that filled the spaces you hadn't even realized were empty. For the first time in many years, Evelyn was no longer afraid. She had found love in the most unexpected place, and it was enough to fill her life with a light she hadn't even known she was missing. And now, with a full heart, she was ready to follow wherever it might lead her.